we're going to talk a little bit about corporate issuance, green, social, sustainable bonds in the US market in particular, or the US and Canadian market. And to have that conversation with me today, I am extremely thrilled to have David Johansson from White and Case Capital Markets down the end. I'm going to ask him some really difficult questions a little later about regulation. See, he's getting nervous. Emily Weng, who is Vice President of BlackRock for Global Fixed Income and ESG Investment and, I don't know, many other things, and an old friend. And I have Swami Venkataraman, who's the Associate Managing Director at Moody's. Moody's, as you probably know, has recently decided to combine its second opinion market, its ESG analysis with its credit rating, which is a very interesting and, for me, exciting development. I want to know more about that. And then, of course, lastly but not leastly, Lisa Bozelli, who's Senior Director of Fannie Mae Multifamily Capital Markets and the world's largest corporate green bond issuer by a country mile, and has been doing this for a while, and has set off a bit of a flurry of interest in other secondary mortgage companies around the world, not just Freddie Mac and Ginnie Mae in the US, but also secondary mortgage companies in places like Malaysia and Australia that are now looking at this issue. So you started a bit of a wave, Lisa. Thank you for joining me today. The objective of this whole conference is to have a discussion and get a sense of how the hell we get enough capital flowing. Now, of course, as I intimated in the previous session, in one way we don't really care about thematic issuance. We just want capital to flow to the right places because we have to transform our societies, our economies in fairly fast time. But the thematic market, which we've talked about in reports and earlier today, has proven to be a remarkably successful marketing tool. And Emily, I want to start off with you to talk about that and how that's worked in BlackRock, how it is working, and what your reflections are in this market, always with an eye of how the hell we grow the corporate market here so it's gargantuan.
Totally. So I've been working in this space for a lot less time than Sean, but enough to see it grow, I think, significantly. I think just on the demand front, looking at the types of funds that we've launched over the past couple of years, where we're focused as a firm, it's ESG, ESG, ESG. I think 70% of our fund launches in the past 2 years have been ESG labeled fund launches. I think more in Europe, but also growing in the US as well on the thematic type of ESG funds that we see. And a lot of this is driven by the labeled bond market. I think the growth that we've seen is incredible, sort of across the various segments. From when I started, I think this market was like less than $500 billion, with like less than $200 billion of green bond issuance a year. And now we've hit over the 2 trillion mark. So I think from the supply perspective, we're seeing that increase. But it's really, I think, also driven by demand. We have pockets for these types of instruments. Speaking of some of the latest fund launches that we've had, we launched a global impact fund in October that's across US as well as Europe. And it's sort of a multi-sector type portfolio, and 55% of that portfolio is green bonds. So we're looking to grow that space. We're looking to grow our products in that space as well. So, in terms of issuance that we see in that market, it certainly helps.
So upwards and onwards is the demand side of the equation. You've also been engaging with issuers on a fairly detailed basis. You pore over these documents, whereas most people are just glancing at them and hoping for the best. So I'm curious to know some stories of the nature of engagement you've had and how that engagement has advanced the discussion, because I know there's some. Give us a bit of a flavour. What you're allowed to tell us, of course.
Yeah. I'm probably going to one-up Alliance Bernstein in the due diligence. But, in terms of how we think about the labeled bond market, we build our own shading system in both green as well as social across both types of use of proceeds, and thinking about how green is it or how social is it. So our shading system goes from light to dark in terms of how aligned you are to some of the climate targets and the net zero transition when it comes to use of proceeds. And on the social side, how targeted you are when it comes to your target population and how you're actually helping that target population in terms of use of proceeds. So our due diligence obviously happens prior to issuance when we meet with issuers as they launch their frameworks. This includes a lot of sovereigns, a lot of corporates. The nuance of the conversations goes down to, hey, I'm thinking about this type of use of proceeds. Is that something that you would consider green? And, we actually give feedback a lot when it comes to that to say, we would like to see these types of targets. We want to see it below this emission threshold. You might want to add this in your framework. So we have a lot of those engagements to, at issuance, obviously participating in that. And then post issuance, where 12 to 18 months down the line, we want to see the impact report. And we actually go through the impact metrics literally page by page to get through all the metrics. We have the engagement with the issuers to make sure we understand all the metrics. I think Lisa has been in the hot seat of my interrogations, fortunately or unfortunately, to make sure we can substantiate this. And that's really because at the end of the day, we're reporting on this for our own funds as well. Our own end clients want to know, hey, for $1 million invested in your green bond fund, what do I get out of it? How many tons of carbon emissions am I saving? What are my, megawatt hours of renewable energy savings? So we're getting asked that question, so we have to be able to stand behind those numbers. So this year, I think we engaged with over 500 issuers, and obviously this population has grown year over year. So it's just getting more intense, and it's something that I think we have sort of a hyper focus on going forward.
I think that's a good segue to Lisa, so you should throw it
Yeah,
in.
absolutely. On to you.
Lisa, tell us why. Why at Fannie Mae you decided to do this? And then has it been successful from interest, or how has it been successful? And then maybe you can just tell us a bit of gossip about how it was like dealing with Emily, being a receiving end of her interrogation.
Sure. So I'll do the dry stuff first. So when we first started our program in 2010, what we were really looking to do was kind of address that triple bottom line, which everyone has thought about. We were looking at improving the credit quality of our guaranteed book of business. If folks who don't know, at Fannie Mae, we guarantee mortgages. I'm on the commercial mortgage side, so apartment buildings. So we're not a direct lender, but we have a network of lenders, and we are responsible for the guarantee of that security, for the life of that security. So we wanted to improve the credit quality. We are also an affordable, invested in affordable housing, which is not the newest type of housing that's out there, not the most efficient housing. So there was a lot of improvement and a lot of room for improvement in that portfolio. In addition, we wanted to try to drive down savings to our tenants. We are very removed from the tenants directly, so it's helpful to have these tools. And then lastly, the environmental impact, which I know is near and dear to Sean's heart. So these three kind of factors are what fed us and drove us to start the program in the beginning. We have two basic programs. One's an in-place renovation, and one is a green building certification program. So we've done about $109 billion over the 10 years, which sounds great, but when Sean throws around his $5 trillion, it's nothing. And it's also light green, right? As we'll talk about the various types of green, this is really kind of transitioning financing. This is not a lot of brand new construction. That's just not our bailiwick. So that was the first question. I'm just going to jump to the gossip question because I do think this is really helpful for folks to understand. We have done BlackRock's role, obviously, in the U.S. has been in the absence of government involvement, really driving this market, along with the AllianceBernsteins of the world. Those folks have really kind of pushed or pulled, and we've pushed is how we keep saying it. And so it's been a real cooperative effort. Hopefully that drives forward as more folks are getting involved. But we've had a lot of lessons learned, and I think over the years, maybe even before Emily got here, we had things like, hey, I really want this bond to be part of a particular green bond index. And so that was one of the asks. And the index at the time would only do green building certification, which in the beginning was brand new buildings, which was not most of what we did. So we hoarded and got these deals together to re-securitize a $500 million tranche, and that investor bought $5 million. So I think there are a lot of lessons learned, as we as investors as issuers try to figure out what investors want, but also try to bridge that to the borrowers, because without that incentive of the lower cost financing, it's really hard to get them to participate, and we wouldn't have anything to sell.
A comment you've made to me in the past is that there's a data challenge for you
Mm.
and getting information, and the growth of the green bond issuance, but also the growth of appropriate investment in right areas would be significantly enabled by data. Can you explain what that data challenge is for everyone?
Sure, definitely. So it is commercial, it's apartment buildings. So actual raw utility data you don't have as a lender on these buildings. What you have is a rent roll. And if people have looked at commercial rent rolls, they can be as much as this apartment, this square footage, this dollar amount. So you maybe don't have the transparency into the tenants that you'd like to have. You don't have the utility data. Sometimes even for the owner doesn't have all of these utilities when you first go to underwrite. So there are a lot of data challenges. We pushed through an energy audit process that existed at the time, but now has grown significantly as a community because we require this energy audit on all of our green financing loans. And they're able to say, what the before and what the after would be on these in-place renovations, but it is a projected number. And so many people come to these projects thinking, I want your raw data before and I want your raw data after. And you're like, dude, I don't even have raw data, right? We're talking about projected models at this point. And I think as we get utility companies more and more involved, as the government is more involved in the utility companies, it kind of drives this forward. So for a place like New York, where there's benchmarking law, we do get raw, anonymized utility data information. We're a national organization, so most of the areas that we deal with don't have a benchmarking law. And so for those folks, some of them, utility companies make us pay for the data if we want to track data, and then some won't give us data at all. So I think as more of the government/regulatory entities get involved in the US, hopefully that will free up more data and we'll talk real numbers.
I mean, for those of you that may be not aware of the point of the built environment, according to the IEA, I think it's 38% of emissions reductions we have to achieve to meet our climate targets between now and 2050 have to come from the built environment. We need substantial improvements in energy efficiency. So this is a critical sector. On top of that, 2/3 of hard assets, discounting derivatives and the like, are property assets on the planet. And of course, in bank portfolios, lending to property is the biggest slice in most portfolios. So you put those three things together, and this market has to take off. So what Fannie Mae's been giving us has been liquidity and benchmark pricing and so on. In Europe, we've got a coalition of 42 banks at the moment around the energy efficient mortgage label, looking at how we get labelling schemes in place. That's the same challenge we're facing here. We're getting there. But it's not just about mitigation, although that is the critical and most urgent part of it. It is also about resilience. If we're going to have an urban environment which is going to survive the shocks we're going through, we've got to better manage water and better manage our social environment, which means things like social housing and multifamily housing. So many aspects. In terms of your tracking, you're just tracking the energy improvements and also the water improvements, right?
As well. And
tell us about that.
Sure. So our program from the beginning has always been a combined energy and water. So it's progressed over time. Right now, the in-place renovation program requires a 30% 12-month improvement in energy and water, with a minimum of 15% coming from energy. The reason for that is largely who's paying what bill. So water is typically paid by the owner, energy more often by the tenant. So we're trying to, again, drive tenant savings. And so, as Sean mentioned, when we think about resilience, water is one of our factors. And when we were dealing with the TEG for the EU taxonomy, it was less of a factor in Europe. And we explained how the states work and that we do have some water stressed areas. And we're really happy that we followed along with that, because I think that has gotten us, again, a lot more data, which is what we're all trying to get just to figure out the problem. But I would say it poses a problem very different from energy efficiency, because everything has to be commercially viable for the borrower. And so everyone sees the benefit of energy efficiency improvements right away, right? It's very easy to explain. When you go to talk to them about resilience and they think about, well, this may never happen, right? I have insurance. So there's just much harder to get borrowers to table for resilience improvements, especially on the impact of climate.
Hence the importance of actually doing this kind of work. The objective of today's conversation is growth, right? And how we do this. Swami, I'd like to come to you. I'm interested in you telling us what the story is about Moody's being to integrate what in the past were called non-financial measures into its credit rating, which is an enormous change. And what do you see as the impact on the corporate sector and, of course, by implication, corporate issuance in the US?
Sure. So we're trying to, in the ESG market, if you think about it, we have three different types of products, if you will. Is that okay?
I think it's okay.
So the most important one that you refer to really is about ESG integration into credit. And the idea there is we remain focused on credit, but we speak to when ESG issues can affect it. So it is not necessarily a double materiality score, if you will, but it's a score that focuses on, are ESG issues going to affect the rating of this company? And we publish two kinds of scores: issuer profile scores and credit impact scores. And the credit impact score, as the name might imply, it literally answers that question. Is the rating of this company any different because of ESG issues? We've been scaling up quite rapidly. By the end of this month, we'll probably be close to 10,000 scores. That's except for structured finance. It's all of fundamental, all sectors, including countries, states, cities, banks, insurance companies, corporates, everyone, infrastructure. And we published a report about 2 weeks ago, which really focused on the scores published as of September 30th. That was about 6,000 almost scores. The interesting thing we found is that almost a quarter of them, 24% of the issuers, the rating would have been different if not for ESG issues. A lot of it lower, some of it higher as well, benefiting from ESG issues as well. So we think that's a very important. So how could it affect? If a rating is higher or lower because of ESG issues, clearly it affects pricing, and clearly it focuses issuers in terms of thinking about how to manage these issues better. So we think that's the key sort of takeaway. About a fourth of the ratings are different. Another 30%, the rating is not affected today, but we think could be negatively affected going forward because of ESG issues. And again, we publish these scores. They're available for investors to look at as well. So in some sense, it's a forward-looking perspective on companies whose ratings could be affected going forward. So I think the thinking really there is, we speak to investors like BlackRock all the time. And one thing we heard very loud and clear a few years ago was, one, rating agencies, are you even thinking about ESG when you rate? Yes or no? And if you are, can you be more transparent about it? Right? That's overwhelmingly, that was the message that came through. And these scores are an effort to do that. We believe we are thinking about ESG issues, but we want to limit as far as ratings go, we want to limit the perspective to where they are material to the credit quality of the issuer. So these scores are an effort to sort of produce that. We have two others, the SPO, we have an SPO product as well that's very specific to the label bond market. And now we're thinking about a net zero assessment as well, which sort of thinks about how companies are aligned with the net zero scenario, where to some extent, it gives us the ability to at least put all companies on the same basis in terms of thinking about issues about greenwashing and credibility and so on. If you articulate a standard and score companies consistently across the board, it gives us the ability to sort of think about it. So there's some connection between the SPO and the net zero in that sense. There's also a connection to credit, because if you're on a net zero trajectory, it has implications for your ratings as well. So in all of these, we're looking to serve different aspects of the same problem.
So how are your corporate clients responding to this? I mean, aren't they saying, no way, Jose?
Well, I think it definitely gets a lot of attention, because if we say we are looking at ESG, and so they really say, okay, will you talk to us? Can we tell you what we are doing, and will you listen to us about our strategy and how we are approaching this issue before you score us or take action? And the answer is, of course, yes. That is the whole intent. And maybe if there's a way for us to talk to them and get more subjective clarity, or more, a more nuanced discussion, rather than just be reliant, sitting outside and based on public information, that's a value that we can bring to the market as well.
Okay, so I think
It
what you're
catches
telling,
their attention for sure, no question about
I
it.
think what you're telling me is you're a kind of police force to the market anyway, so it sort of doesn't matter too much whether they think it's just happening
No one
because
likes
this is
them
risk.
anyway, I think is what he's saying.
Yeah,
No one likes them, so it's
yeah.
fine.
Which is good news. And of course, the backstory of this is that S&P and Fitches are pursuing their own related strategies, not exactly the same, but a similar issue of trying to integrate, let's call it a variety of data points around risks linked to climate change sustainability into their credit rating. So it's not just Moody's, their own. Charitably, I'll say they're copying you, Swami, but which is good news for the change. I guess whether it means there's an extra incentive for issuers to do thematic or signalling issuance to draw attention to what they're doing is a kind of open question, right? I mean, in Europe, we're seeing some companies that do issue green bonds getting a stock price bounce and it holds up. What do you reckon? Will this fuel the signalling activity of a green bond?
I think people ask us that question. If a company issues a lot of green bond, will you upgrade their rating? It's sort of a, and I think what we say is, if the amount of issuance of green bond is that much, it eventually comes to a point where you're investing in assets that are green assets, and it gets to a point where it tends to transform your business and reduces the risk. Yes, it will affect the rating. So it's not directly connected to simply the issuance of a green bond, but the fact that those bonds are investing in assets that have a certain profile, which could over time accumulate and change your risk profile. That will change, or that could change the credit rating.
Hey, isn't it exciting?
It is exciting.
David, who's working in capital markets, a partner in White & Case, and of course we've got a bit of a capital markets, I'm not going to call it revolution, I'm going to start some sea change happening at the moment. We've got the SEC coming out with its proposed regulations and so on, not to mention what's happening in industry anyway and the credit rating agencies. What's your reading and what are your pearls of wisdom for the audience?
Right. And I think I'd start with the green bonds. In Europe, our offices at White & Case have been working green bonds and green financing for years. In the U.S., we're slower to the game, and we're finding a lot more challenges. One is just when you think about the $5 trillion, and okay, you can do a green bond, and that one's fairly straightforward, the use of proceeds, and you can get there. But for a lot of our clients, they're looking on the issuer side at doing refinancings, that you have debt coming due, you need to now refinance, push out the maturity. You can't do that as a green bond, use of proceeds is refinancing. But you could do a sustainability-linked bond. But there are challenges with that. There are challenges because the market is not as mature as you would like it to be. The standards or the frameworks are not as clear as you would like. And we have regulatory constraints. There was a discussion on the earlier panel about non-deal roadshows and dialogue. And it's not that easy with a corporate issuer. Corporate issuer is subject to SEC regulations. It's a Section 5 violation to do an offer and sale outside of the context of a good exemption or registration. What does that mean? Well, that means you can't go before you formally launch your offer and really have a brass tacks discussion about what would be in your sustainability-linked financing. And that's a challenge because once it comes time to issuing, you have a very short window, right? In the corporate world, you're going to do a one-day book building. You're not going to do a long roadshow. And there's not enough time for a lot of dialogue about what the goals are, how you're going to measure them, how are you going to be accountable for this. And it's a real challenge for us with the corporate issuers. It's different from Europe. They don't have that constraint. It's different. The municipal financing is outside of the reach of the SEC, and they don't have the same regulatory constraints. I think BlackRock, I mean, your point earlier was excellent, right? You can do things outside of the context of the offering where you have this dialogue, you have this investor feedback, so at least you can work on your framework. But it still leaves a challenge when it comes time to do the issuance. Or with Moody's, I mean, lots of engagement there because thankfully that is exempt. Moody's is not an investor, and so you can talk to them, but still challenges are there for the day you go to issue your bond.
So do you think this is one of the key reasons of the difference between the European issuance levels and the corporate and the US issuance levels? This particular narrowness of the window and the difficulty of therefore communication and complaining? Or is it litigation threat?
A variety of factors. Also, what's helpful is what's happening here today, right? And Europe was ahead of this. This dialogue is very helpful, right? This is a dialogue that you can now have, and that this is allowed by the SEC. And this is the time to talking about standards or talking about what that issuance will look like and what the challenges are in trying to get there. And not to do it in the heat of the moment when people have half a day to build a book build.
Is that your experience, Emily? I mean, I'm interested in your reactions to what David's saying as a barrier, as an issue, and as a way forward here.
Yeah, I mean, this is why our team does a lot of the work that we do. I think the earlier we have those conversations, right, non-deal related, to say like, hey, this is what I'm thinking when it comes to our framework. What does BlackRock think about this, right? Again, not deal related. We're happy to offer that feedback, and we do that all the time. In fact, we have like a whole paper published that's like on our website about this, and all I do, I just like point issuers to it to say, hey, this is the white paper. This is what we think. This is how we shape bonds, right? So that's part of our work to encourage the issuance in this market, because we obviously have demand for this. We have pockets for this in our fund. So, we try to be as transparent as possible. This is not like a pop quiz where, like, if you get it right, we buy the issuance, right? But we try to really encourage that from our issuers. We try to be partners in this space.
We have a similar problem at Client Bonds, as Emily knows, because we're tracking every green or social or sustainable bond market for index providers and for fund managers like BlackRock to provide our view on it. The more we can get the conversation going early when it's in principle, the easier it is for us to simply say, yes, it's in the list, makes the index and so on. It happens after, it takes forever. So if any of you in the issuance game, there's a bloke at the back called Neil Wardley. Stand up, Neil, who's our head of markets and is based on the East Coast. He's the man. See him and get his email. And please tell us when you're talking to Emily, talk to us as well. And let's see if we can make all of this happen faster and easier. Because, David, you've given us a really good clue about how to take this forward. But you haven't drilled down adequately into the SEC stuff.
Right.
And I'm curious to know your reaction to that for the audience.
Right. So the SEC, it's fascinating. It's massive. It's in the spring of this year, over 500 pages in the proposal, and it hits so many things. But for the financing, there is something that causes you to have a long pause when you're thinking about setting your targets. Part of the proposal is if you have a climate-related target, that will now trigger disclosure as proposed. And it goes both ways. It's to the earlier panel, Mark's point, it'll be helpful that you'll have more disclosure mandated by the SEC now that you set a climate-related target. But it cuts the other way, that you've now put yourself, if you set a climate-related target, to now have to hit the SEC requirements. And that's different than what you're seeing in some of the bond financing. It goes to your project, your scope, your measurements, but your plans, your medium-term plans, your long-term plans. If you're involved in credits or renewable energy credits, the cost, and that one is commercially sensitive, and that would have to be disclosed as proposed. These are things that, when I say pause, that you would have to take into consideration as you're looking to do your green financing, because if you're an SEC reporting company, a 10K, 20F filer, this will be in some form or another coming down the pike, and you have to be aware of it as you're setting your green targets for your financings.
So it's a merging of the sort of overall corporate assessment entity stuff, or rather an integrating and the use of proceeds issuance we've got to start being aware of here, which potentially complicates things for corporate issuance, doesn't it? Is this going to make it harder for corporate issuance?
It adds complexity. It does add complexity. On the other hand, some of the other parts of it are helpful, right? It's a uniform framework. It's going to apply to all SEC reporting companies. there are large aspects of it for scope 1 and scope 2 that are going to be broadly applicable. If you're otherwise doing those, then you could see if you have to make the corporate spend to comply with the SEC requirements, you can now do the corporate spend to do green financing. And so maybe from that point of view, it does spur something. So it can go both ways. It adds complexity.
Emily, you're a global investor. You're looking at green dollars everywhere. You're acutely aware of the relative paucity of issuance in the US compared to global because of the nature of the portfolios. I'm just curious on your reflection about where this is going. I mean, curious about reflection on what David said and SEC rules, but I think more generally too about corporate appetite, picking up the conversation with Swami. Where's this going in the US? And I'm hoping it's a hopeful answer, but I need a hard hit answer.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think on the SEC point, just in terms of green financing, if you're doing the reporting already, right, to the point that you need disclosures on scope 1, scope 2, this certainly helps because what you're reporting on is emissions avoided. Again, like how much energy are you saving? So if anything, it helps those targets. It certainly doesn't detract from it. So I think if anything, it spurs more issuance in this space and specifically in the use of proceeds space, just given the trajectory of disclosures that's expected and sort of the alignment that's expected on an ongoing basis. In terms of commentary on where I think this is headed on the US side, I think this year was a very good testing environment, if anything, for where we see corporate green bond, social bond, labeled bond issuance going. If we look at sort of the year-on-year issuance, yes, it's gone down, but it's not necessarily more than what we've seen go down in the global market when it comes to the issuance. In fact, our capital markets desk, we run numbers every single week, tracking how much issuance have we seen year to date. What does that mean year over year? And then specifically for the green pocket, what is that versus that total issuance, right? So if we look at USIG, it's around 5% of the total USIG issuance is coming in this green format. And we actually haven't seen that gone down all too much as a percentage of the total. Yes, broader issuance, I think, is down around like 20-25%, and the green label is held on. So, that tells me that if an issuer is coming to market, they're just as likely to come to market in a green format if they have the project financing versus something like a GCP or refinancing. So I think it's actually especially held on in Europe where, if we look at EMEA IG, the global market is down around 18% and the green format's only down 12%. So, this goes to show that it's really sticky, this format, right? Because there's outsized demand for it, we have pockets for it again, and I think that definitely resonates when we look at where new issuance is headed, especially in this rate environment.
So it's a similar story to the US and other markets. Standard Chartered were telling me that in East Asia, I think I mentioned earlier, ex-Japan share has gone up from 25 to 33% this year. That's thematic, which is like amazing. We're not talking about France. We're talking about ASEAN and China. So this is a global phenomenon, this kind of change. So as bond markets bounce up, well, that's a bit of a question.
Bounce up? Wait, what? We're waiting for the bounce up.
I suppose that's a broader view. And maybe, Swami, I might go to you.
Sorry, but I do have a positive take on that too, to the point. I mean, it's not, this year is a off year, so to speak, clearly.
Yeah.
The fact that label bonds are a higher share tells you something. You're also seeing the fact that there are more and more banks and financial institutions setting net zero targets, for example. And if you looked at the beginning of 2021, and let's look at short-term targets, right? And if you look at the GFANZ numbers, there were 0 short-term targets in the beginning of 2021 among the financial institutions. There's 300 individual targets now. So that has to mean greater demand for these kinds of bonds will be coming. Now, this year, clearly the entire bond markets are down. But as the bond markets eventually come back, as the economies recover and change, that more targets among the investors has to mean more demand for these. And we've never seen the oversubscription for green bonds hasn't yet translated into pricing differences. But the oversubscription, again, is an intent. There's a lot of demand for this. So, I mean, I have a positive view of where this is headed.
Hey, good news. You want to weigh in?
I hate to be contrary. It is, I do have a positive view. I mean, it's great. Everyone's talking about it. But I think for folks who've been here and been in the market for a while, the past 2 or 3 years, the plus side is there's a lot of attention. We're going somewhere. The downside is there's a lot of attention, right? And so I think risk aversion in corporates has been huge, right? So many lawyers, no offense, that are just very risk averse as we continue to make these decisions about making pathways. What are the pathways? Are we agreeing on methodologies? How does everybody feel about it? So I do feel as we're heading into a recession, there's a lack of qualified personnel in the market, right? Because the tight job market still is relatively. I think there's just a lot of anxiety in corporates. If that's what we feel like, I think that's what we see on an everyday basis. We're hopeful because I think we have to drive change. People are, there are other components that are, especially in housing, forcing the change. But I do think that there is a big negative as well that's out there.
Fantastic. I want to go to the audience and ask for a few questions or comments at this particular point. We've got some microphones floating around. We've got a hand at the front, a hand here, and I want to take a round of questions, if I may, for people first who haven't had a chance before. So up the front here. Thank you so much, Brian. Right here.
So, I think
Just introduce yourself, please.
my name is Bhavna Thakur. I work at a private equity fund called Everstone Capital. We have a very large green energy business, which is green infrastructure, renewables, EV, battery business, and of course, some of these businesses will be green bond issuers, I think, within the next year or so. So we are having conversations around this. But separately, and we raised our green infra fund in a very tough environment before it became popular. And the last year it's all been about ESG, green infra, but we've had LPs like IFC that have always asked us to follow ESG norms. In fact, when I moved to the US 2 years ago, I realized the US was way more behind on ESG compared to where we were coming from in Asia. I mean, things have been very strict for us with our European LPs and IFC, and I'm so glad because I think we were ahead of the curve. But as I look into ESG in the US, I mean, even yesterday I was reading an article about how poorly ESG funds have performed. There's so much ESG bashing. And is this just a nomenclature issue or is there actual reluctance? I mean, every other day you read an article about ESG is dead, and we don't believe that because I think you just have to consistently move forward. But in the light of that reaction, I mean, as investors at BlackRock, you've had, the Florida state pension say they're going to withdraw money. How do you deal with flack on ESG?
Good question. Just over here, please. Any other hands in the back there? And there's one at the back there and one here as well. I'll take speakers up and spoken first. Neil, if you can bring the microphone. Just behind you, Brian. This chap up there. There you go.
Hi, this is Arpit Narayan from MathWorks.
Keep it short if I can. So I can get as many as
This will
possible.
be very, very short. So I have a question on the differences and the similarities between EU SFDR and SEC's climate rules. And we are seeing a trend that in EU, a lot of funds are downgrading from Article 9 to Article 8. What are the learnings that US has to take from that?
Tough question. Okay, at the back. Who's got the microphone? Stand up and tell us who you are.
Matthew Lee, MSCI ESG Research. So there seems to already be some good debate about carbon-related metrics with green bonds, but we'd love to hear you compare that with adaptation and resilience type of green bonds and what sort of metrics you guys evaluate there.
Okay, I've got to add a couple more in the middle here. Please put your hands up so I can get the mic to you. I'm sure there was someone else who had a question. Just here.
My name is Michael. I represent SB, a Nordic financial institution active in the space. One area I'm curious to understand is the green bonds are natural by purpose, use proceeds. But how do we get the transition bonds off the ground, dealing with the brown to the green to something more sustainable? Transition bonds been talked about, but we have seen very little activity in that space. Happy to see, how to move that forward.
Good question. Ted here's got a question just behind you, Brian. Any last ones in the back? Go, Ted.
Oh, Ted, I'll just make it super quick here. So, looking at green bond indices. So, for example, if I look at some of the criteria of the indices and I look at what's green for multifamily CMBS, you get into it, and some of the criteria actually says it's on a property by property basis. So, first part of that is if you just said it'll be LEED, X, BREEAM, Y, HQA, DGMB, so on and so forth. If you just have a threshold across those certification systems, do you think that would improve flows towards the green sector in real estate? Second part of that is if in the EU taxonomy, the certification systems actually had an equivalency to where it was LEED, Platinum, BREEAM, Excellent, so on and so forth, that say were EU taxonomy aligned, then the indices then linked to the taxonomy, do you think that would help? So thank you.
Good set of questions. Anyone like to tackle any of them to get us going?
I feel like I have to start.
Let's start with, I always like to be on a BlackRock panel. Let's start with Emily.
Okay. Florida. I mean, I don't want to talk about it, but I think we have to. I can't speak for the whole firm. I'm just going to disclaimer that. But like from a personal point of view, sitting where I sit, I just wish this weren't a political issue, right? I don't think we see that happening in Europe or, APAC for that matter. I mean, China, to talk about China, like they have such a crazy green bond taxonomy that I know you, Sean, and others at CBI have worked so hard on. And that's actually improved so much throughout the years, right? But, maybe as investors, this could be a loss that we may have to take, right? But it is what it is, would be my comment. But I mean, from our team and our perspective, we're launching ESG funds, we're launching impact funds, very focused on green bonds. I think we're just laser focused on doing what we do really, really well, right? Making sure that we don't get sued, we have the right, legal disclosures in place, that we're really tight on our impact reporting, every single bond that we include in our funds, that we have that due diligence in place. I think that's what we need to do. That's part of my job. That's part of why, our team exists, and any of the fund launches that we do in the ESG space to make sure that they speak for themselves. And then it's up to our clients, right, to decide. So that's on Florida.
Well, rating agencies have been asked the same question. Investors have a harder job of it in terms of dealing with it, I think. For us, the answer is a little easier. The question is, why do you incorporate ESG into credit ratings? Why are you doing it? You have to be financial only, to your point, Sean. And our answer is a little easier in the sense that all we are saying is, look, if ESG is going to affect the credit rating of the company, we have to incorporate it. We have to incorporate all risks for relevant to credit, and that's all we're doing. It's an easier answer in that sense. It's tougher when you have to, when you have to say that I want to invest based on the value versus values debate, so to speak. Right? That's a harder problem for us. But for us, it's very clear. We are incorporating ESG to the extent it's relevant and material to credit quality, and that is absolutely that's absolutely what we've always been doing, and we should be doing.
Swami, at a Moody's event just before COVID down the road, one of your colleagues said to me when I asked him a question, is Florida's credit ratings been put down 2 notches because they've taken on climate risk for coastal reinsurance through the Citizens Reinsurance Corporation. So Mar-a-Lago, as far as I know, is reinsured by Citizens Reinsurance, the Florida state company, where they've chosen to ignore climate risk when Swiss Re and Munich Re and all the others have said, or at least priced it very highly. So ESG is going to come around and bite them, I suspect, if they're not careful going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I think part of what we would look at when we look at rating insurance companies and their exposure to physical risk is where they are writing their policies and what the exposures are in that. And, hopefully we can be we can get a lot more better at that as we integrate the RMS, acquisition in terms of publishing specific data on these kinds of exposures.
Interesting stuff, Lisa.
Very interesting.
You want to take any of these questions?
Sure. I'll start with the easy one because we talked about commercial real estate. So we'll start with the commercial real estate section. We have a GPC program, and we annually review all the certifications that are out there, kick some off, add some, based on our priority of energy efficiency, right? That's our energy and water efficiency. I think where you're heading, it smells a little bit like a taxonomy, which makes me a little nervous, right? So I've been hanging out with Nicholas too long, right? So when I think about taxonomies versus principles, I think setting a line in the sand is very challenging, and it keeps a lot of folks out. And so I think the better solution is what we basically have now, whereas everyone is expected, because of the principles, to disclose everything about their program, and then all the investors are expected to do the work, right? And to read and process. So I think I totally agree with you. There should be, like, it'd be great to think that there's one line in the sand, but I think practically it would be challenging. I think thankfully people have kind of circled around, similar requirements, but it is an enormous undertaking to look at that whole world of certifications.
Yeah.
So,
David, do you want to tackle any of the questions that we've got on
Well,
the
the
table?
one, if I understood correctly, on the EU and the downgrade, right? So I assume what this is talking about is an increase in the cost of compliance and driving behavior. And you have two things that come to mind. The first one, 20 years ago, Sarbanes-Oxley, it was supposed to be the end of the world, right? That we were imposing this extremely expensive regime. And here we are 20 years later, and you're not seeing what you had been seeing, all the restatements and all the problems around that. And on the other hand, the cost, there is deficiency when you have that many companies doing it and that many people doing the expertise. That gives me some hope on the SEC side. On the other side, yes, you also have long-term a trend of companies waiting longer to go public, some companies, private equity, taking them out because of the high cost, and this will be one more additional cost of being public. So you may end up with a few fewer public companies, but on the other hand, there is something to be said for how this will go. I think the SEC is estimating about 500,000, give or take, to implement this per company.
I mean, a key difference between the European approach, certainly with green bonds, catalogues, and taxonomy. One US government official said to me, the US will never adopt a taxonomy because it's got the letters TAX in it. Okay, I'm trying to avoid using the term in the US. But a key difference between Europe and so far in Australia is that in the US is that in Europe, the sustainability of portfolios and banks and corporations is the essence of the disclosure regime. Now, they've taken the idea, TCFD, carbon disclosure, and turned it around and said, actually, what we really want to know about is what are you doing to address sustainability going forward? What do your investments look like? That's the underpinning. Now, there's work to be done, I'm going to say. We are about to start in January a major usability review of the EU taxonomy. Some of you will be thrilled to hear that because there are some challenges. I'm saying it's a work in progress, but I want to stress it is a work in progress. It is a bit like designing an electric car. When it's finished, we should be able to all get in it, press the button and drive off. But when you're designing it, like a Tesla, it's hellishly complicated and messy, and we're still trying to get it right. But that is a substantial difference between the proposed regime in the US and the regime in Europe at the moment. I actually expect, my own view is the US will gravitate towards the EU regime if it proves to work. So what the US has got to wait and see is all this sort of stuff going to actually be usable? And at the moment, I think the jury's out in terms of usability and practicability. So if we can make it work in Europe, we'll see an advance, and that will lead to more harmonisation. I want to comment on the transition stuff because this is a core part of our work. We are saying we need transition investments. We need to take high carbon and shift it to low carbon as quickly as possible. Clearly, that's not just steel companies and cement companies, it's also property. Yeah. Because that's what we're doing. We're transitioning the property sector. At some point, when energy is cheap and clean everywhere, we don't care about energy efficiency in Fannie Mae's buildings. But we need that change in the next 30 years until we green everything in the energy system. So there's transition trajectories that we have published and used to guide or guidance in property sector and shipping and steel and chemicals and cement. And we're bringing out more. We're talking to SBTI, some of the Science-Based Targets Initiative, Transition Pathways Initiative and so on, trying to get as much commonality of approach as possible. People like RMI, who've been so important in, say, the shipping transition path, are part of our expert groups. So there's an awful lot of work behind the scenes trying to get a commonality. But we do need to have trajectories. So when someone comes out and says, I'm transitioning, you need to know, is it actually ambitious enough? Take Shell's plan, for example. They've got a transition plan. They're going to get net zero by 2050. But you know, they're going to keep investing in new fossil fuels in the meantime by about $10 billion worth. And the way they're going to get to being net zero is plant a lot of trees. In fact, they're planning to plant trees across an area the size of Spain. That's a lot of trees. And it's not front-loaded, it's back-loaded. That is, most of the emission reductions of 2040 onwards. We've got a problem. We need to have frameworks to assess these things. And that's what we're working on with other parties. And you'll see a lot more. Now, on the back of that, we'll see transition bonds, we think. But do they need to be called transition? I know Emily's colleague, Ashley Shulton, used to tell me, stop with these other names, stop. I'm sick of blue resilience, just make it all green. That's a market issue. If someone wants to call it green or green transition, I'm happy, whatever works. I think there's an argument that identifying investments that require further scrutiny, that is high carbon or low carbon, could be called something useful. But I'm happy to let the market decide. Emily, are you in Ashley's camp or you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm chanting the same tune, fortunately, unfortunately.
Well, because I think it's structure, right? Like, does the use of proceeds bond or the SLB bond structure fit your need? I'd ask the gentleman who asked the question, because I think those exist, they're established. We have the frameworks, we have the pathways, we have the KPI. You know, ICMA just published their KPI in Victoria in June. So I think the tools are out there. What you call it, you know, it's market.
I mean, I make two comments on that. It's either, well, the two ways we evaluate it within our broader framework is if you're doing a use of proceeds structure, that's got to be green, right? It can't be brown to less brown type of transition. If it's a transition bond and we think it's a green bond, that's how we'll bucket it anyway. I think this market suffers a little bit from the proliferation of labels as is. So, you know, for our portfolio managers and our broader platform, we try to simplify it as much as possible, right? So I have PMs come ask me all the time, like, hey, what is this transition bond? I'm like, oh, it's a green bond, it's not a green bond. That's the labeling I give them, right? And it's got to be green transition. And then, you know, on an issuer level, holistically, we look at it in terms of, you know, what your externalities output is. So, you know, in the talk of transition, set targets that are aligned to SBTI, get them verified. Like that helps you as an issuer, and that automatically gives us that investability that may not otherwise exist, especially if you're a high carbon sector.
We've got to wrap up. We're out of time. We've got to move on. We could talk for ages. I would like to talk for ages, but I want to ask you to give us a few parting, reflecting comments, bearing in mind the job we've got to do to fix this damn planet. Excuse the swear word. How do we do this? What's going to happen in capital markets? David, give us hope.
And I think the dialogue that you're seeing here today, the discussions that you're seeing here today, are a very significant part of that path, and that you are seeing the engagement. We're hearing from the issuers they want to engage with investors and vice versa. They're putting in the resources and the time to do this, to have the sustainability reports, and to have that dialogue, and that's going to lead to the financing and the change.
Well, that was pretty good, actually, in terms of hopeful. Thank you. Swami.
Quickly, something about what she ended, but I might maybe frame it a little differently. If we have really credible KPIs, then you don't need to think about transition bonds. Anything you issue, any SLB that you issue would be very valuable, and a lot of investors would look at it because it might open up the rest of the capital structure, not just the one bond that is being in the market right now. But that really depends on the KPIs being credible. And part of that is what we're hoping to do is the net zero assessment will look at that. We'll talk about whether those KPIs are credible or not.
Fantastic news. That's really cool. Lisa.
Sure. I think we need more issuers, more different types of financial asset types. You know, we pushed into single family residential. That's 2 years old now. I think we need more people like that. We need to push it down the credit stack so that you can see the credit benefit that Swami mentioned. We unfortunately have a very tight credit box, so we're not that interesting. We really need other types of lenders to do that. And then lastly, I think selfishly, ABS in Europe needs to grow so that people understand the asset class and can invest in that as well.
Emily, the last word, like the first word, goes to the investors who are driving this market. Today, you represent $130 trillion of institutional investment capital. What's your reflection for everyone?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, we have homes for this kind of stuff. Make sure it's good. We're here for feedback. I'm here for feedback. I look at these all day long, literally. So, if you have a question about your framework, use of proceeds, happy to give you that feedback. And yeah, I think we're, primed for sort of evolution in this market with regulation, or lack of it, I guess, more disclosure, and more metrics that we can track. So I'm laser focused in my role and just making sure that we're doing our job well. And I think this is a time where that's even more critical. Speaking of SFDR and the SEC, we really have to put our money behind every single investment and be able to defend it. So make that easier for me.
There you go. There's a challenge for you all. Make it easy for Emily. Thank you very much. Thanks, David. Thanks, Emily. Thanks, Swami. Thanks, Lisa.